Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast of the Interlinked, an initiative under the Center for New Economic Studies at Opengender Global University. Interlink seeks to foster nuanced discussions on the interdisciplinary nature of global challenges. By exploring the socio-political landscape, we aim to break the intellectual silos and analyze pressing issues from multiple perspectives. If this is your first time tuning in, we encourage you to explore our previous episodes where we have engaged in thought provoking conversations on a variety of topics. We are pleased to welcome our guest for today's discussion, Ms.Ashika. She is a junior research and evaluation officer at NSPCC, National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And she has done her post graduation at LSC in development studies. With a keen interest in research within the field of development economics, she brings valuable insights into contemporary labor market dynamics. So, in this episode, we will be discussing the evolving nature of labor markets and really the rise of gig economy and its broader implications as digital platforms and flexible work arrangements reshape our employment structures worldwide. We really want to understand the challenges and opportunities that they present for both the workers and the policymaker. So, with that, we will start with our very first question, the coronavirus. So, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of informal workers who lacked access to social security and financial support. Now, as economies recover, what do you think? Should governments focus on formalizing these workers, or would that risk disrupting livelihoods? And how can policies balance worker protections with economic flexibility?
Yeah, I feel like this question is extremely timely, specifically in the Indian context, because I feel like the pandemic really showed us the structural vulnerability of, among other things, the labor market. Um, I'd say more than 80% of India's workforce operates within the space that we call the informal economy. And when the lockdown hit, it was just millions of people suddenly without work, without contracts to substantiate any work that they've been doing, without any safety net, without any insurance. And while they're visible technically all around us in India, they do wide array of works. They are at that moment, it felt like they were truly invisible to the state as well. And the pandemic and the lockdown suddenly increased their visibility by a lot. In terms of you could really see the issues and the amount of work that they had done previously. Um, so we'll start, I think, I'm not sure if this was a reaction to the sudden visibility because of lockdowns, but in 2021, I think the government had launched like a e-Shram portal. It's just like to build a national database of unorganized workers. I think this ranged from construction workers, domestic helpers, street vendors, you name it. Um, so it was kind of to build a count and to understand how big the informal economy is. And I think the last number I remember hearing is about 290 million workers that have been registered on this portal. It is a big number, but I feel like registration is it's a very preliminary step to understand the scale of the informal economy. Um, so when we talk about formalization, I feel like this idea of visibility, invisibility to the state is very important because the formal economy is very visible to the state, right? So if you're talking about formality of the informal economy or formalization rather, there's this concept that I think is very relevant. It's called legibility. It's from a book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State, where he talks about that when the state tries to make people legible, that means a couple of things. Among others, it means they are taxable, it means they're governable, countable. So these phrases don't really apply to the informal economy right now, right? Um, the state, if it wants the workers to be visible, what does that mean? That is what we need to see. In a sense, what does formalization mean? Does it mean more paperwork for them? Does it mean that they suddenly get improportionately taxed? Or does it mean that they get the social security that they currently lack. So I feel like the definition of formalization is very important in this context if you're talking about it. That's like kind of the first tension. It's this visibility with the state because formalization sounds great on paper. It sound, when it's framed as benefits, protections, inclusions, but it comes with a lot of burdens on its own, which would be an added difficulty to the vulnerabilities that informal economy already um, face. I think another point that needs to be considered is that informality can sometimes be the rational choice for certain groups of people. Authors, I think Euting and De La Iglesia talk about this. The idea of choice, especially for women. The informal sector provides flexibility, control over working hours. A lot of women in India, when we talk about informal space, a lot of them are involved in the garment sector specifically. And a lot of that means working from home in terms of stitching or repairs or anything related to the garment sector. So the women in informal economy, they prefer that kind of working system because they can manage care responsibilities side by side. So when we talk about formalization, all that goes away again because the work hours are, it'll be as per set rules, and then you'll be getting paid as per those hours. So if we are taking away that flexibility from the women in this particular case, for example, just for an example, then are we giving something better in exchange? That is a conversation that definitely needs to be had. Um, Another tension with this particular issue is informal economy has kind of in fill the gaps, right? For where formal institutions just don't fit in at the moment, in terms of extra labor, in terms of small businesses and things like that. And it is an ecosystem of its own that's built a lot around mutual support and kinship networks. And it is not just um, something that exists in isolation. Just because it's informal doesn't mean that it's disjoint or that it is not dependent on a wide array of networks. Take women's self-help groups, for example. The way it came up is because there was a recognized mutual need for money and microcredit. So formal systems of governance and regulation cannot apply to these kind of ecosystems the way it is right now. So if we try to formalize them, it is undermining a level of regulation that exists in the informal space currently. They are managing on their own in a way that the formal system does not understand. So that is something that definitely needs to be recognized. Um, so I
Um,
think
If I
you
might
want
add,
to,
yeah, if I might
yeah.
add to this point, I would say that, of course, worker cooperatives would need good legal recognition as well. Of course, informal sectors do fill gaps, as you mentioned. But I feel like for them to flourish properly, because they don't have as organized of a structure as the formal sector does, what really is important is some legal recognition so that government schemes would help them, because government schemes are to help these self groups and the women cooperatives, as you mentioned itself. So maybe these worker cooperatives could pool resources and get legal recognition in that way. And maybe the government here could register businesses by easing some paperwork and reducing some costs. And at the end of the day, maybe partially provide some kind of health insurances and pensions without really forcing for full formalization, but having a partial formalization just so that it helps them. But of course, not with the idea that we're going to completely revolutionize the sector and then make it a complete formal economy. Would you agree with that? Does that make sense?
Um, Part of it, yes. I feel like a major reason that the informal economy is the way it is and have not been given insurance or given these facilities is because it works for the current economy, having these low cost employees who are, who will work for long hours for the pay that the major corporations or anyone else suggests, right? The system where they don't have a representative, where they have barely a voice, works for the larger system. So it is um, it is kept that way intentionally. Um, so I feel like having that legal representative could help, but it's it's in a way of what it will bring for them. For the informal economy, what will that bring? More scrutiny into their methods, more scrutiny into maybe the land that they're living in that they don't have papers for, maybe the work that they're doing that is it's not done in the way that it's supposed to be done, or the small business is not registered. So if it brings more scrutiny in that way, that is just putting them more at risk. So it is, I agree with your points in some sense, it's just a very fine balance. And I think there's a lot of points that need to be understood before we can talk about formalization at any level. It's even a question of, it's just, I feel like entirely redefining what formalization means for this particular sector. We can't go in with the idea of general formalization. That's the way I see it. Um, yeah, I think that
Yeah.
pretty much covers my response to that question.
Speaking of the fine balance that you mentioned, there's a lot of confusion based on the rise of gig work because that has blurred the lines between formal and informal labor, with many platform workers lacking social security and fair wages. So, in your opinion, what do you think? Should gig work be regulated as traditional employment, or does it require a new legal and economic framework that acknowledges its nature?
This is again another big question, specifically in the Indian context, because gig economy has grown very rapidly over the past few years. So, and this ranges from wide variety of workers, right? Delivery agents, cleaners, beauticians that come to your home, online tutors, and there are multiple different platforms. So, and they exist, as you mentioned, in that legal sort of gray zone right now. They're not quiet employees, they're not independent contractors, somewhere in between. Um, so when we ask whether they should be treated like traditional employees, I think it is important to start by recognizing that um, traditional labor sort of frameworks, they don't really fit very well into the gig economy ecosystem as it is right now. Um, they have, well, certain schedules or certain thresholds and metrics by which their performance is calculated, and uniforms also sometimes, but they're not often guaranteed minimum wages, job security, health insurance. In our previous conversation about formalization, all these points came up as well. So I feel like they're kind of pushed into a new category. I think in 2020 there was discussion in India for a social security code for gig workers and platform workers, and that was a big move. But the implementation, I feel like, of that is still weak in terms of there's no clear framework of what that entails at all, or how the contributions will be collected by these workers, or how they will actually receive the benefits. So on paper, there are these policies that exist, and that's how it often goes with the informal economy. That if you start looking into it on paper, early in 2000s or mid 2000s, there have been policies that have come up and been discussed. It's just the implementation of it that always comes up as a barrier in terms of such a wide variety of people who do different kinds of work in this big ecosystem, and how do we teach them all? Which is why I feel like it is interesting to instead focus on what states are doing locally in terms of, I think Tamil Nadu had a recent subsidization of, I think it was e-scooters for gig workers. So it's just like a small investment from the state side. It kind of acknowledges the high cost that these workers put in for their job. And it is also at the same time acknowledging that the state has a role in supporting these workers and not just regulating them, which is, I think, another very important point that the informal economy or the gig economy is just not, they're not like a group in society that need to be regulated, managed. We need to bring down their level. I feel like it is high time to recognize that they are an important part of the economy on par, and sometimes even more than the um, formal economy. Because as COVID showed us, without informal workers, this economy is just not going to move forward. The gap fillers, they're sometimes called, are the ones that are really pushing the economy forward. So their role, I feel like, needs to be recognized more. Um, how do we design protection systems for these gig workers given their different roles? Um, I think I think regulating them in old school of I call it old school, but it is very much still prevalent. What I mean is traditional employer employee framework is not going to work because gig economy, they don't have their employer is a company. They know it by just that name. They don't have like a line manager or a super manager or anything like that. They're often sometimes what drives gig workers is customer reviews, and the algorithm that helps them. So it's a completely different ball game altogether when we think about protection systems at all. I think what might work is like a hybrid system because there is, along with formal labor law, there's also an increased focus, especially nowadays, on digital governance. So I feel like gig economy somewhere lies right in the middle of both. So looking at both and kind of, you map it onto a Venn diagram, see the common points. That's where the gig economy lies. And so in terms of laws and protection systems as well, I think an overlap, someone who would look at it in an overlap, you'd really come to know what these workers need. Um, I also think it's so across the world, the formal work system is more or less similar. That's because it's the usual 9 to 5, and then you have these many paid leaves and these many um, holidays and sick days and so on. But for gig economy, I feel like it is a very country specific ecosystem. What is happening in India may not be what is happening in the UK, in China, in a very different country. So I think India kind of has to develop its own model, or each country has to develop its own model that consider the specific types within the gig worker economy and specific vulnerabilities that they face in that country's context. Because I mean, oftentimes the people engaged in this work are young men and women from low income households. And as I mentioned before, flexibility is one thing that workers in this economy really value. It's just a broad point to keep in mind. So, yeah, I think reimagining labor protection as it is the way to go about for this particular group.
On that point, so I would like to mention, if it is correct to summarize it in the way that you mention, that we could, with proper implementation, then introduce laws that recognize gig workers as a third category, not full employees, but not completely independent either. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think a third category would be accurate to say. I think it's wrong to try to fit like a what's the phrase? Circle in a square peg. Circle peg in a
A
square hole,
one
that kind of
size
thing.
fit all policy.
Yeah, I don't think I'm just generally not a fan of general universal policies. That might be me. I know a lot of people who are.
Actually, the explanation that you gave for this current question perfectly ties in with our next question, which is basically that urban informal economies are deeply linked to migration, yet city policies often marginalize street vendors and daily wage workers. So, should governments integrate informal workers into urban planning? And if they were to plan to do that, then how would it be efficient? And would it be more efficient then to transform them into formal jobs? And as you mentioned about different models in different countries, so could you give some examples of what models have worked in different countries regarding this area?
Um, so in Indian cities specifically, I feel like informal workers are everywhere, right? They are street vendors, cleaning homes, driving rickshaws, recycling waste. Um, and I think a major issue is that when a city is designed or reimagined or anything new is coming up, these workers, even though a lot of their work itself is happening in the center of the city, in the thought process, they're kind of left in the periphery or kind of treated as a nuisance to be cleared out, instead of integral parts of the city itself. Like it is their space as much as it is anyone else's in that city. Um, so, I mean, the framing that should we formalize them or transition them into proper jobs, I feel like that framing itself can be a little bit problematic because it kind of gives the impression that informal workers are temporary or, that they're not here to stay for a long run. Uh, when in reality, as I mentioned, that they are, central. And an anthropologist's definition that comes to mind whenever I talk about this topic is whole citizens, and it is a phrase called insurgent citizenship, which is that they aren't just because we frame them to be informal economy, they aren't passive recipients of the urban space. They claim space, they help in shaping the economy, they build networks of their own, like people in the formal economy do. Um, so in India, I think in 2014, because India is the context that I'm most familiar with in terms of this, I can speak for the Indian context. I think there was a Street Vendors Act in the years escaping me, but it was a pretty landmark law, is what I would say, because it gave street vendors the legal right to operate in public spaces. But again, as it's always the case, implementation is the one that the issue that has come up, because I think in Delhi and probably many major other cities, I did my schooling in Delhi, so that is what I'm familiar with. Vendors still face evictions and harassment, because they take up space that are of commercial interest of bigger companies and businesses and property management. So there is like a deep tension in how the state views informality as kind of not legitimate, not really a part of the economy, like as something like it's a failure from the state's part of regulation, and that's why the informal economy has come up. And I think that whole narrative just needs to be scrapped, honestly, because if that was the case, as um, GDP rise or as economies developed, informal economy, the population would have gone down if it was a regulatory failure, if it was temporary. In fact, it is increased. And then there is no, then the previous explanation doesn't hold anymore. If the population in the informal economy is in fact increasing, how can that be explained? Unless the fact that it is changing, it is ever evolving, it is adaptive. So there needs to be protection that can accommodate these kind of groups specifically. Um, Also, in terms of when you say transition to formal jobs, I mean, the job market, if I was to currently say, is not able to hold in those who are willing to do formal jobs either, the current economy market. So when you say transition into formal jobs, we are talking about transition into a space that just um, the jobs just don't exist even for those who are currently looking for it. So I feel like that is a statement again that just does not hold or will not work in the long run. And it's again, we are kind of hiding away from looking at it in the eye and just saying, yes, the informal economy exists and yes, they need protection. I think the focus instead should be on integration because there is space for both to exist. It's just that one is given less importance than the other. And as you mentioned, Geetaali, it means giving them like legal protection, access to infrastructure, and most importantly, I feel participatory governance structures because I feel like the lack of voice is very important in the mainstream. And the only way to build a solution that works is for it to be participatory in nature. Co-production is another phrase that's often used with participatory themes. So, like in urban spaces, when we're talking about urban planning, when we should not just, you know, how it currently happens is that the decisions kind of top down and it trickles down and it affects everyone and it is expected that everyone should be okay with it. But I feel like for the informal economy specifically, I think it's important that a lot of conversations happening, that there's a recognition that the space is also theirs. Um, I think the example of Seva Union in India is very important because it is a kind of a positive example in terms of people that came together, the informal economy that part of the informal economy that came together and has an important voice of their own. And in Kerala, I think fisher folk specifically have been, you can see like kind of the state informal economy integration in the way that recently there have been a lot of disasters, flood related disasters in Kerala over the past few years. And informal fisher folk and vendors have been on the front lines for the help for these disasters. So you can kind of see that state informal partnerships is possible in certain states, and they have been compensated as well, the fisher folk. So so there, I feel like it's just what these examples state is just the selective in which in the way that state recognizes informality within the urban space. It's just that when a disaster strikes, these people are front in line. When COVID strikes, informal workers were called, especially those from lower caste, were called to burn the bodies, or they were called to clean the streets. So it's just right now it's very selective in nature, and that's what you can see in urban planning as well. And that's something I think that needs to be fixed. Um, so I think it is just in terms of including people at their own terms rather than assuming, okay, this is formalization. This is the informal economy. This is formalization, and this is how they should be transformed over. This is how we should include them. And the fact that inclusion means giving them proper jobs or formalizing, just I feel like that idea should not be the lens at which we look at it with.
I would just like a clarification. You mentioned when you're talking about participatory governance, and you mentioned how it's even when we are shifting people into formal jobs, or we are making the urban planning more inclusive to people from different strata. Um, there is this kind of a selective thing where we discovered it in coronavirus as well. So you mentioned that we need to rectify it. So could you give some examples on how we could rectify it or attempt to rectify it? How the government could take steps, or the people themselves, or is it the structure of the society, the economy? What shift needs to be made? What kind of paradigm shift needs to be made for that?
Paradigm shift in order to not selectively recognize the informal economy
Yes,
is
is
would
it
that
some
be
kind
the
of
question?
yeah, is it some kind of a law or policy that must be enforced? So what changes must be made so that we could rectify that situation as well and acknowledge it?
So the thing is, I feel like the laws and policies exist. Like I mentioned, the eShram portal, right? It gives um, the unorganized sector a chance to register and the government to see the, where they are located and what they do. So I feel like the laws and policies exist. It's just that it's not in the forefront of discussion. So I would say, in terms of the paradigm shift, it's just about shifting the focus, really. It's that the informal economy comes as an afterthought for any urban policy planning and not as how do we accommodate them or how do we make cities easier to navigate for these vulnerable groups as well. It's just about focus, really. That's what I think. Because I feel like there's just more than enough policies and laws that exist that are just not being implemented already. And I don't think adding on to that mix is going to be helpful. That's the way I see it.
So, moving on to financial markets and the perspective of financial markets. Despite their economic contributions, informal workers often lack access to formal banking and credit systems, trapping them in cycles of financial insecurity. So, can digital financial services and fintech solutions bridge this gap, or do they risk creating new forms of exploitation? And if they do risk of creating new forms of exploitation, then what are some alternative measures or methods or ways that we could think of which could provide good financial security and effective financial security to workers in the informal economy?
Yeah, this is a tricky question because in countries like India, the access to formal banking system rather has been historically very limited for informal workers, women, and those who live in rural areas. The recent boom in fintech in India has been um, very vital in increasing in kind of widening the net of those who have access, but that on the opposite end of things, I think it has made certain gaps very visible in terms of access to certain technology, which is expected if you want to be involved in any kind of fintech, any kind of app. Um, there is just a basic requirement of having a mobile phone. And if you don't have that, then the access to all this is cut off. So I think that is just a very glaringly obvious difference that I know there have been companies in the past that have given out phones to a lot of people in rural areas and then given them access to um, um, unlimited data in order to bridge the gap. But you're giving those resources to people um who are again not have not been exposed to the credit markets previously, and thus they are made more vulnerable, uh they kind of put in the deep end of these situations. So that has happened quite a bit. But I think a question that needs to be asked in this particular area is, what are we providing them access for and on whose terms? Because when you sign up for any fintech kind of app and such, there are a lot of terms that, as someone who is involved with technology every day, sometimes you're just not able to grasp it as well. So for someone who is new to this space, you can imagine how confusing it could be. Um, because I personally feel like if you give some access to these resources without regulation, it just creates a direct pipeline for exploitation of these groups who are already vulnerable. So there is an approach called the bottom of the pyramid approach. So when you look at the informal economy, the number it is, imagine like a pyramid, and the number of people in the informal economy is it's the largest, so it's at the bottom. They're kind of at the bottom of the financial pyramid. But them being at the bottom is has made quite a lot of big corporations realize that they are an untapped market for certain resources, for example, fintech, which kind of prompts them to provide these resources for this market and then introduce them to credit apps, for example. I think in 2021, or I think somewhere around that time, there was reports in India about a lot of shady loan apps, which a lot of people, vulnerable people, signed up for and took loans from, and then later they were offered, I think, small, quick loans, kind of like easy loans, but it was at very high interest rates, and later I think borrowers were harassed and doxxed, and some of them um, were pushed to suicide, and it was horrible. So you can imagine just the vulnerabilities that have opened up uh, just simply by giving these resources. Um, Informal economies have their own credit system, their own, and it's often from friends and family and their local networks, and that is usually considered dangerous because there's not much regulation. But you can see even in the digital fintech space, with regulation, they are still exploited, and they are still vulnerable. So it is clearly, is it a better pathway? In a lot of ways, yes. In a lot of ways, no. Um, I think interestingly, I think it's in Africa, there's a system called Hawala networks, which is an informal credit system where they use phones, and it's just you go and give money to a local Hawala center, and then they connect, and you say who you want to send the money to. For perhaps it's your cousin in another part of the country, and then the Hawala network in that part of the country will give that money to your cousin. And then the representatives meet ever so often and they settle the debts, which is such an interesting credit system that will not work in the formal space, but it has worked for many people in the informal space. And later they were branded as terrorist networks post 2001 because they thought the money money for funding terrorist activities was funneled through Hawala networks. It's so I feel like the financial means that informal economies have come up with from internally, it's just very easy to dismiss them as not regulated, as thus being dangerous, as funding these networks when they are actually not. They're just looking to help the part people of the informal economy, but these major uh, apps and fintech and with all its shiny aspects are considered to be formal and safe when they're actually not. Um, I think a way to make fintech work for formal informal workers is first of all and very basically just regulation and enforcement of these regulation. Second, again, financial literacy, and more community driven learning models to expand the network of certain apps that may be helpful for informal economy. Accessibility, very important. In even if they do have phones, often language is a barrier. The interface being difficult is a barrier. So you can't make an app for the uh, majority of a population and then expect informal those members of the informal economy to adapt to that adapt to that UI. Um, I feel like financial apps for these groups should be targeted and they should be heavily regulated by the government. Um, and I think an NGO partnership is a great way to do it. There are a lot of NGOs which are working towards financial literacy or financial help in local communities across India. And I think there's no better way than to partner up with people who are already doing good work in the space to understand what the community might need. Um, and I think a feedback mechanism or a grievance redressal is especially important for the informal economy because they are particularly vulnerable. There might be more situations where they might be exploited, and thus they might need a more immediate grievance redressal system. Um, I think also generally data governance is a widely discussed issue, especially with Aadhaar and the KYC. That's been a lot of digitization of our identity in India that's happening right now, and which the informal economy are often kept completely in the dark from. They just hear these terms and they're supposed to have the paperwork done for it and the app set up for it and their e-identity. And often they don't understand what they might be getting into when they go to these government offices and stand in line and they're asked to sign here and there. So there is a definite power asymmetry that an information asymmetry that takes place in the tech space, not to mention the fintech space. So I feel like fintech really has the opportunity to empower, but I think it needs to be highly targeted. And again, just bringing back the co-production bit, especially with local NGOs and communities. I think co-production always helps when you're creating a resource for a particular group of people with a particular set of vulnerabilities and conditions.
Yes, I mean, completely true. Fintech is a great tool, but without regulation, of course, it can trap people in debt instead of helping them. And I mean, to some, like, just extend on the points that you previously mentioned, the mobile app that you mentioned, the another example I know of is M-Pesa, if you know of it in Kenya,
Is that?
which,
Yeah.
yeah, so I felt that was similar to the app that you mentioned before in Africa, which lets informal workers send and
Oh
save
no,
money
there's no
as well.
app.
All
There's no
right.
app.
Oh,
That's the
okay,
best
okay.
part of it. It's
Oh,
just a informal credit system where you go to a small shop. They're just called Havala, and then you go give the certain amount of money and say, okay, I want to give it to this person, and you give their number, and then the Havala representative in that country ensures happens. The
okay.
representatives meet each other and even the differences out every couple of months or so. It is wizardry, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, and the microloans, of course, that you mentioned as well, they are such a honey trap because, of course, they're very dangerous in the sense that they say that they will use transaction history sometimes and don't require big land and assets as collateral. So,
Yeah.
of course, it would be a big honey trap for pe workers, especially in the informal sector. But then again, it's just a vicious circle of debt trap.
Yeah.
And with that, I feel like what we can end this discussion with is what we really need are good consumer protection laws, which stop these loan apps from charging crazy interest rates or just keeps a good regulatory framework in hand and a very effective implementation of words, which we have been reiteratingly moving forward with each question. And so, with that, I would like to say thank you so much for the insights. This discussion has been incredibly insightful and helpful. And thank you so much for coming and taking the time to have a talk with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I think yeah, I think it was very insightful, and the questions as well I feel like were very, very relevant to the current space in India.